Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our CiC webinar on neurodiversity and mental health. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'll be using that throughout today to have discussions. My name is Harry Saville. Some of you might have seen on the previous webinars. So I'm a managing consultant psychologist here at CiC. I'll just give it another minute to let people join, so please make yourselves comfortable. Starting to get a few hellos in the chat, so hello, everyone. Just got a question here in the chat. I'll just answer this now before we start. So the session has been recorded today, so it will be available after the session, so please do reach out afterwards. Okay, I'll get started while people are introducing themselves. So I'll introduce myself as well while we're here. So my name's Harry. I'm a managing consultant psychologist at CiC, working in wellbeing in the workplace, but also within neurodiversity for the best part of this decade. So started off working in schools, working with individuals and children one-to-one, working in universities, also working in the workplace doing one-to-one coaching, before doing a lot more consulting, working with organisations to help them build more neuro-inclusive cultures. So some of that will be really useful today when we kind of look at the intersectionality and the co-occurrence we see between neurodiversity and mental health. So that's really what we're looking at today, is what's the link between neurodiversity and mental health? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? What are those co-occurrences? So throughout today, I have opportunities for discussions. So I'll try and have some questions to get you all thinking and communicating in the chat as well. So please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, what your experiences are, what you think about what we're talking about. I'll start off just with a little intro to neurodiversity. I'll do this on all our webinars on neurodiversity this year, just to make sure everyone has got that understanding of what that term is and where it's come from. So what is neurodiversity? It's a term that refers to the natural variations in human brain function and embraces that people have different ways of thinking, learning, processing information. So it highlights that people naturally think about things differently. We are all unique and sit within that complex spectrum, different strengths, different challenges. So this picture, I've said in previous webinars, is something I really like. It's a way of describing and showing, visually demonstrating what neurodiversity is all about. You can see on this picture, some people might be more process driven, some people better problem solvers, some people more visual thinkers, some people better with numbers, some people more analytical. I guess the idea being, especially from a neuro-inclusive standpoint, the more we can grow the understanding, grow the kind of diversity within our teams, the more the benefits we get as an organisation, which is something we can talk about in future webinars as well when we think about the value of neurodiversity. So you may have also seen of some of these diagnoses spoken about with neurodiversity as well. So neurodiversity is often used as that umbrella term. So common learning differences such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, Tourette's. So that's not an exhaustive list. It's kind of constantly evolving. These are just some of the most common diagnoses that I've got experience working with. I think key thing from this is, it's important to recognise and remember that everyone's experience is unique, even within these diagnoses. So two people may have the same diagnosis, but may present with maybe some different challenges, different strengths, and that can depend on maybe the the individual, kind of the characteristics they have. There'll be a threshold people meet in order to meet a particular diagnosis. Doesn't necessarily mean everyone is exactly the same. It can also depend on the circumstances someone's in. So you think about the workplace we're in, how we're working, the job we're doing, those challenges, those strengths might come out in different ways. People can also have multiple diagnoses. People don't perfectly fit into one box. So if you think about people with dyslexia, might also have a diagnosis with dyspraxia, or some ADHD might also have a diagnosis of autism. So how that can all feed into how that presents for that individual in terms of characteristics. So key message from this slide, although there's some diagnoses here you may have heard of, I think the important thing is not to make assumptions about what individuals' needs are. Something we spoke about in our webinar last month on workplace preferences and discussing that. So we'll have that webinar again later in the year. But it's really important to keep that open conversation with individuals. So what we'll do today, so looking at, as I said, the links between neurodiversity, mental health, challenges to wellbeing in neurodivergent employees. It'd be great to kind of hear your experiences. If anyone here is neurodivergent, kind of share, to hear from you kind of what your experiences are, what the challenges have been, what helps, what doesn't help. I've got a list of what I've encountered doing a lot of workplace assessments and coaching for people in the workplace. So I'll kind of talk through my ideas. It'd be good to hear from you as well. And then lastly, kind of how we can support ourselves and colleagues as well. So thinking about what we can do individually to help manage our own resilience, but also thinking as colleagues what we can do to support others. It's really important from this that we don't see it as it's the individual's responsibility to just manage their well-being, and it's nothing we can do about it. It's something we can do as colleagues to help build that neuro-inclusive culture. So have a discussion about that, and maybe you can share your ideas about what you've done as well to help support your colleagues. So as we go through, please keep using the chat. I'll have questions come up and I'll keep looking in the chat periodically. So please keep sharing your questions, your thoughts, your tips. Be surprised as well what you might say might resonate really well with someone else in the chat today. Give them some ideas about what they can do differently. So please do keep sharing. So on that note, start off with the first question. So what is the difference between neurodiversity and mental health? So there might be some different opinions here about how they come together. Are they the same? Are they different? What goes underneath them? How do you define the difference between the two? Someone just shared here as well, the links between menopause and neurodivergence. It's a very important chapter. Yeah, this is a really good point. Something that needs to be spoken about more, and how it can lead some of those cognitive challenges as well. So that's really important to raise awareness of, something maybe we'll be able to do in our future webinars as well. So yeah, thank you for raising that. So thinking about this question, so someone's put in here, so one is neurological and the other mostly psychological. Yeah, so it goes, I guess one's tied to our health and one's kind of, I guess, more fixed, I guess, the neurological side. Yeah, as someone's mentioned here, our neurodiversity is inbuilt, mental health varies. Yes, it can fluctuate. Somebody was used the word fluctuate there. Yeah, it's kind of thinking about it's not always the same. It can vary based on our situation or what we're going through. Neurodiversity will always be a factor for a person. Yeah, exactly. Mental health will fluctuate. That's really how I see it as well. That idea that neurodiversity, we're talking about the way we think, our characteristics, our ways of working, what we find helpful, our ways of processing information. Mental health is something, again, we all have and fluctuate depending on our situations, what we're going through. Yeah, I think a lot of you've hit the nail on the head there in the chat. So neurodiversity is different in the way you perceive and engage with the world. Mental health is about your mental well-being. Yeah, someone mentioned here, mental health, something that everybody has. Yeah, it's a really important way to think about it. It's not, it's often stigmatized, mental health, especially in the past. So it's something to think about, similar to physical health, something we all have, can change. It's important for all of us to manage mental health, mental illness, very different. Neurodiversity is not a mental health issue unless left untreated without no attention. That's a very good point. So something we'll talk about as we go through here, the links with co-occurrence and why that might be. So that's a really good point, and we'll talk about later. So we'll come back to that. The idea of being neurodiverse, but then the world around you, how we interact with that may lead to those mental health challenges. Neurodiversity can affect your mental health, not the other way around. Yes, I guess our mental health doesn't lead to some of those diagnoses we saw under the umbrella. It might lead to some characteristics that might be similar. The idea of kind of mental fogginess sometimes, or how we process. It might lead to kind of characteristics that are similar, but it's, I guess, not that permanent state. Neurodiversity is about those cognitive differences, not as an illness, absolutely. So neurodiversity, more the ways we think, mental health, those diagnoses we'll show in the next slide as well, is something that we can have negative mental health or bad mental health at times seen as an illness, whereas neurodiversity, we're talking about just the ways we think, which also feeds into one of our points later as well around the stigma around neurodiversity, how people might see it as an illness. That's something really important to think about as well. Yeah, so ND is the hardware, mental health is the software. It's an interesting way of looking at it. To put a point here, so the threshold for external stresses can be lower due to sensory challenges, which can predispose neurodiverse people to anxiety and other conditions. That's a really good point. So when we come to the co-occurrence slides later, this could be one of the reasons why this could happen. Absolutely. A couple of last points here. So mental health refers to conditions that can develop over time, may require medical therapeutic intervention. Absolutely, so it can happen later. It's not something just the way we think. It's something that's more fluctuating. And lastly here, autistic burnout from masking can cause an external presentation of mental health symptoms. Absolutely, the idea of burnout and masking because of the situations we're in is really important to think about. So I've given a few clues away now to some of my questions later, why that might be, but it seems to a few of you here have already thought about that, which is good. So yeah, quickly onto mental health, what that is. So a lot of you have kind of hit the nail on the head there. The idea of the neurodiversity, as we spoke about on the previous slides, the idea of it's just the way we think, the way we process information. It's a permanent state. Mental health, it's more fluctuating. So mental health includes our emotional, psychological, social well-being. And I'm sure a lot of you here have experienced that when you're experiencing maybe challenges with mental health, maybe being more stressed, more fatigued. How you interact with the world around you can be different. So you think about how you communicate with people, the choices you make, how we handle stress. It feeds in as well to the idea that it's not permanent, it's that fluctuating state. So if you think about those times where you've experienced stress or been anxious or even gone through a bereavement, gone through that grief stage, burnout, some of you might have been unfortunate to go through that on this call today. We know what we are. We know that we're not being ourselves. So please, again, feel free to share in the chat what are those signs for you where you can feel that difference, that change in state happening. Is there anything, the behaviour or the way you think, or you've experienced any physical symptoms that make you feel you're kind of acting out of character or different to how you normally are or your normal state? So I know for me, maybe sometimes getting a headache, butterflies in the stomach, especially when feeling stressed. Maybe difficulties with sleep, that can sometimes happen. Anyone else willing to share in the chat? Think about, is there anything that you notice? Maybe you might be acting slightly differently to how you normally are. Difficulty concentrating, yeah, definitely. Maybe more distractible. I know I get that sometimes. It can be really difficult, can't it? Especially if you're in a meeting, you feel like you're thinking about different things. Social withdrawal, absolutely. Big one. Can be kind of a vicious cycle, that one, can't it? Socializing is one of our really positive coping mechanisms that can really help our mental health. When we socially withdraw ourselves, makes us feel, can lead to even more challenges. Yeah, other people saying here, pulling away from relationships, irritable. I've definitely experienced that. Maybe being a bit more impatient at times when being a bit more stressed. Nauseous, yeah, absolutely. I definitely get that. That kind of link with the butterflies side as well. affects your appetite sometimes. Disturbing sleep, poor decision making, energy levels, so how you get your energy throughout the day. And some of these cognitive ones are really interesting. If you think about differences with neurodiversity, we're not taught neurodiversity, we're thinking about the way we're thinking kind of permanently, our ways of processing information. In these situations, we're talking about those moments where it might be our normal ways of thinking are impaired or different. So that those poor decision making, different to how you normally make decisions, being more distractible, irritable, lashing out. So kind of emotional control, panic attacks, brain fog, overthinking. So yeah, kind of rumination, absolutely. Poor executive functions. Catastrophizing. Someone made a really good point here. So mental health often affects physical health too. So there's migraines, bowels, foggy thinking. Yeah, absolutely. It's all linked in. Another, I always like to say with the self-care side as well, it's useful to think about in terms of how we can support our mental health as well. They're linked together. Support our physical health, can support our mental health as well, which is really good. Sometimes I don't notice my symptoms and take others to point it out. So yeah, something an exercise we'll do later as well, thinking about what are those signs for you that maybe experiencing some of those, that stress, or kind of your mental health is impacted. Motivation, so kind of staying on task, decision making again, procrastination. Yeah, so you can see there how it is that fluctuation. It's not always the same. There's just certain situations where that occurs. So what are the co-occurrences? So I've had a little look through recent articles and research, pulled out some of the most recent statistics around co-occurrence between neurodiversity and mental health. So first of all, British Dyslexia Association found those with dyslexia higher risk of developing or being stressed, anxious, or depressed. Roughly 20–50% of adults with ADHD have major depressive disorder. About 50% of individuals with ADHD have some type of anxiety disorder. So that's from the Attitude magazine. So if anyone here has got ADHD, I always find Attitude magazine really interesting to look at. Got some really interesting articles, statistics, and just sort of strategies. So if anyone's interested, if anyone here with ADHD, that's a really good website. 80% of autistic adults experience mental health issues during their lives. That's from Autistica. And the National Autistic Society found that 47% of autistic people fall into the severe anxiety category. So quite a kind of interesting statistics here, kind of seeing that link together. And I think that's often why people put the two together or can get confused between some of the sorry, thank you for answering the question there in the chat. As the website is Attitude. It's a magazine, but also a website. So thank you for sharing that in the chat there. So yeah, these co-occurrences can often lead to confusion in what's causing the symptoms. Kind of to see one of the characteristics sometimes associate that with just a mental health difficulty. Can lead to sometimes people thinking that maybe mental health is part of neurodiversity. So a lot of you've already spoken about in the chat kind of what those links are. So what could be causing this link? A few of you had mentioned sensory sensitivities. Big one. I think I'll definitely share that on the next slide. Fatigue, burnout, masking, some of you mentioned as well. I'll definitely talk about that on the next slide as well. What else could be causing these links? What else in the environment for the individuals when they are neurodivergent? What could be causing these difficulties? I'll put up in the chat now. So whoops, name away. First one, undiagnosed neurodivergence. That's a really good point. Yeah, there's plenty of people that I've done assessments for in the past where they've described it as consistently as kind of a weight's been lifted. They don't blame themselves anymore. They understand why they think a certain way, and they can get support. They can get before. Masking. So something we talk about a lot with psychological safety. People covering up their challenges or their differences, trying to act in a way that they feel they should do, not sharing if they're having difficulties, and then kind of taking that home with them later and dealing with it later. It can lead to a lot of fatigue, burnout. So a question I'd ask there for that one is why are people masking? Lack of support. So if you think about the rigidity of some of our workplaces, how can we have flexibility? Is there opportunities for people to work in a way that suits them? Trauma caused by professionals who are uneducated and mismanaging. So people don't understand maybe what neurodiversity is, how to manage that. Using inappropriate therapies. Yeah, I've definitely heard some people going through inappropriate support mechanisms that they haven't been found really beneficial to them. Environmental stresses. Yeah, that's definitely it. The idea of what's around us can be causing a lot of that. I think a lot of similar to what we in the previous comment, kind of lack of support, masking. So I mentioned earlier, sensory sensitivities, definitely a big one. About the built environment itself. I'll talk about that in more detail on the next slide. Rejection sensitivities, I was mentioned as well. So yeah, the idea some people can experience that kind of heightened sensitivity to that rejection. Absolutely, that can again impact on our mental health. Social expectations. Yeah, how we're expected to fit into societal norms. Lack of awareness. Lack of self-awareness too. Yeah, awareness in general. So lack of awareness of people we work with, how that presents, why we're acting a certain way, can lead to kind of confusion in our communication with our colleagues, or they can misinterpret our behaviours, and yeah, which can also be difficult. Lack of self-awareness. So yeah, as I mentioned, people are getting a diagnosis later in their 30s, 40s, 50s. They often afterwards feel like, oh no, I really understand myself now better. I understand what I find useful. I understand why I do things a certain way. Absolutely. So that awareness all round is really helpful. Feeling lonely. Absolutely. People can feel really isolated at times, especially if they don't feel like they can share their differences, or if they struggle in social situations as well. I think that's a big one. The way people behave towards them. Yeah, so kind of that lack of understanding. Self-esteem, fear, really big one. So how it affects our confidence in certain situations as well. An example I always think about is even note-taking in meetings. I know it's something that doesn't happen as much anymore, but having a minute taker, even just being in certain situations, people can feel real anxiety about being in those situations. So especially if someone struggles with that kind of processing what's being said and getting it down on paper. Misdiagnosis. Yeah, similar presentations, definitely heard of that before. Comment here. So I believe that there are many of today's adult society that experience mental health challenges that are exacerbated or they found hard to manage due to an unknown, undiagnosed neurodivergent characteristic. Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, I've seen that with workplace assessments I've done, where that language wasn't used when they were at school or in their early lives. So they've kind of gravitated to their strengths in their work, like we all do, but it's led to them having challenges maybe in certain aspects of their life. They're not sure why that's happening or unaware of why that's happening. So you definitely see, I definitely work with some organisations where they've had maybe with graduate schemes where younger generations are more aware of those diagnoses, more aware of what they find helpful, the value of that awareness, which I spoke about earlier, and they know what they can ask for as well. So I think there's value in that, but definitely people who have that like less awareness or understanding can be a real challenge. Absolutely, it's a really big point. But yeah, the fatigue of masking, understanding context sometimes leaves you drained. Trying to process and live in that kind of a rigid, neurotypical workplace can be really challenging. Or just life over the world in general. It's being misunderstood. Genetic and biological factors. There is some research on that. I think it's a good point to make, especially with ADHD, the links between, I guess, dopamine regulation, the links with our executive functions, but also links with the mental health symptoms. So definitely some neurological links there as well, especially with ADHD. Anxiety is personal perception. If you understand things differently with autism, you could be more prone to anxiety. Yeah, certain parts, especially with autism, I think I've seen a lot of links with anxiety. Yeah, and just how you understand or how you deal with certain situations can be more challenging. The PTSD, so that trauma response, I've definitely seen, I'd say it's part of that mental health side, but I've definitely seen that in the workplace where people have had very negative experiences in a previous place where they've been maybe bullied or discriminated against. They've come to a new workspace and they're very easily triggered by behaviors that, even if it's a safe environment, can lead to a very kind of trauma, a big trauma response in them because they've had that negative experience in the past. So yeah, it's an important point to make. Denial of diagnosis. So some people, again, linked to that stigma, feel about having a diagnosis, avoiding it. Just conscious of time, so I'm going to keep moving on. So thank you, everyone. Keep sharing your thoughts, why this might be. I'll share a few others that I've kind of put together. So the idea of definitely stigma around diagnosis. Please also share in the chat if any of this resonates with you. If you anything you'd add, any of your own experiences, please do. So first of all, stigma around neurodiversity, often being perceived as less able in the past. People hear a diagnosis and they might be scared about how they'll be treated in the workplace if they're perceived as less able to do a particular job. That often leads to people hiding their diagnosis or not talking about it as much, or someone mentioned in the chat, not going to get a diagnosis or trying to avoid that conversation. So that's definitely changing. The more we have these talks and the more we talk about the value of neurodiversity. As you can see, there's the rates of diagnosis and rates of people identifying as being neurodiverse increasing dramatically over the last couple of decades. So that's not just a sudden increase in all these diagnoses, it's just that people feeling more comfortable talking about it, there's more awareness. So, but when there's stigma there, people can mask their differences. That's where people try and act in a certain way they feel they should do. So highlights the value of how we create that safe environment as well, which we'll talk about later. Helpless, lack of autonomy. So thinking about that flexibility in the workplace, people feel like they're in a situation where they can't work in a way that suits them, they're unable to get certain adjustments, lack of kind of control over their environment. I think for all of us, when things feel out of control, things feel a bit more stressful, right? I think that's something we can all relate to. So I think in those environments where we're unable to work in a way that suits us, people can feel really helpless, which can lead to further stress. Something I've heard of where people have maybe had a change in manager. They've had one manager who's really supportive. It's changed and suddenly different manager works in a different way. They're unable to get the kind of the little adjustments they find really helpful. Suddenly their environment becomes very stressful. Which leads me on to the next point, that unsupportive leadership, lack of support. So are those conversations having about having adjustments? Yeah, are those adjustments available? Sometimes the questions said kind of, or what's thrown back at people sometimes is, oh, like, we can't afford to do this adjustment. We can't give this to you. So it won't be fair to everyone else. So the idea of trying to treat everyone exactly the same sometimes be quite rigid in our workspaces. So that can sometimes be a challenge. Spoke about masking, but definitely the fatigue. So I mentioned in the chat the link between fatigue and masking. So I've heard of a lot of people trying to act in the way they feel they should do, taking longer to complete certain tasks in the workplace, working in environments that might be quite draining for them or overwhelming, putting themselves in social situations or situations where they feel less comfortable but feel they have to, not sharing the challenges they might be having, then taking that home and feeling a lot more fatigued, and it can lead to a lot more those kind of fatigue, burnout symptoms as well. Being stressed, overwhelmed, so thinking about if we are in those helpless situations, maybe from an organisation standpoint as well, sometimes overwhelmed with the work we've got to do, the environment we're in. So I mentioned loneliness in the chat earlier as well. Yeah, the isolation, something that we looked at, or has been looked at a lot during lockdown as well, how people felt kind of isolated during that period, got their coping mechanisms taken away. So that could be a big challenge as well. Social anxiety, if people communicate in different ways. We think about those with diagnosis of autism, how they might communicate might be different. They might struggle with small talk, struggle with processing non-verbal communication, or process kind of communication in a different way. They might find certain meetings or small talk or office norms a bit more anxiety provoking. Managing change, again, something that I think for a lot of us, change and uncertainty can be really stress provoking. For some people, it can be, especially with those with autism, can lead to a lot more when things change quite rapidly and quite regularly, or suddenly. That can lead to a lot of anxiety as well, a lot more than what we'd see in someone with who's neurotypical. Sensory sensitivities, lastly, so someone mentioned this in the chat earlier. So if you think about if you are in the office, even at home, or if you have to commute to work as well, think about all the sensory inputs you're taking in that situation. So think about the lighting of an office, the noises in the office, the acoustics of a room, the smells there might be. The reason why that's important is some people can experience that, those sensory sensitivities who are neurodivergent. So we see that with autism, sometimes with ADHD as well. So for you, what a particular environment you're working in might be not stress provoking at all. Someone else could be really overwhelming, really stress provoking. It can lead to some of those mental health symptoms we spoke about earlier. So some of you mentioned that irritability, impatience, struggle concentrating. Those are things that people will regularly experience. I look at the chat now. Someone's put in a comment that constant requirement to come out as neurodivergent. Yes, that kind of tick box kind of have to disclose in order to get adjustments. That's again something that hopefully is changing. I know in previous workspaces I've been in, previous clients I've worked with, there's hopefully a shift now more towards offering adjustments regardless. But I think that to me that's always a healthier way of doing it, just having those adjustment conversations more regularly with and just asking people how they work. So we spoke about in the previous webinar on workplace preferences, just not feeling like you have to be having that diagnosis in order to have those conversations. It's really important from a colleague or management point of view. Just opening that conversation up regardless of those diagnoses and asking them what they find helpful can be really helpful. So someone's put a question point here. So anxiety over what counts as a reasonable adjustment. Able to discuss this. So fear over potential for social backlash. So yeah, kind of that leap of faith of kind of having that conversation. Do they? And I've definitely heard that before. People have asked for something, they've been turned down. You mentioned their being perceived as preferential treatment. It's the idea of equality over equity. So trying to treat everyone exactly the same over adjusting to each person's individual requirements, and it can be really difficult. Definitely heard that with managers or organisations have said, "Oh, but we can't because we can't treat you differently to everyone else," and not seeing it as how do we adjust ourselves to each individual's individual requirements. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really important point. Neurodivergent adults often parenting neurodiverse kids. Yes, it's a really good point. So thinking about well-being and put this on the list, the idea of being a parent of kids who are neurodivergent as well, which is something that you see very, very often. You know, we're talking about characteristics that can be passed down to kids like anything else. These aren't illnesses that are passed down. These are characteristics we're talking about. So clearly we're going to see that if someone's diagnosed, they can see it in their kids or see it in their parents. It's absolutely, and how they manage that at home and the work-life balance as well can be a strain. So I think thinking about that as well, that's a really good point. So everyone wants to feel normal, and as a society, that term normal needs to change. It's usually used far too often in a negative way with neurodiversity. Yeah, I think that's why I really like that neurodiversity spectrum, instead of it being a kind of very us and them. It's very much we all have our own ways of working. Let's try and adapt to different. Everyone was in that normal is that everyone is different. I think thinking that way is much nicer. Yeah, and that perceived reasonable adjustments. I've heard the term reasonable adjustments from a legal standpoint. You often hear that when you're coming from HR or legal conversation about this, but really thinking about what's going to be helpful to help get the best out of an individual is a much more helpful way of looking at it. It's going to benefit everyone to put those adjustments in place. Conscious of time, going to keep moving, but thank you everyone for putting your thoughts in about what you found stressful and what's affected your well-being from a neurodiversity standpoint. yeah, please do keep sharing. So how can we support our own well-being? If anyone's got any thoughts, please do share in the chat as well. What do you do to support your own well-being? I think really about this is really about how we build our own resilience as well. So a really important point from this is we're not trying to put, I think, the emphasis on or responsibility on the neurodivergent individuals to manage their well-being. Absolutely not. I think that's something we'll talk about right at the end, is what can we do as colleagues to support people we work with. There's definitely a few things we can do in terms of managing our own boundaries. That's someone's right on cue, put that right in on the chat. So thinking about how we manage our own boundaries, how we notice those signs in ourselves, not to be running on empty. So we kind of discussed this earlier, those signs that you notice in yourself that could be signs of poor well-being. And someone mentioned in the chat as well, kind of, I actually don't notice in myself. Sometimes I notice it, or other people tell me that I'm acting differently. So what are the signs in yourself that maybe you're starting to feel a bit stressed, or you're approaching empty? Is anyone willing to share in the chat? Is there anything that you notice in yourself from a neurodivergent standpoint as well, when you feel like, if you feel like you're masking, or anything that feel like you find is a sign for you that you might be starting to get a bit more run down? So wound up very easily. Our smallest things, yes, constantly feeling and being sick. Yes, that physical side as well. People have put thoughts as well about what they do they find helpful. That's setting boundaries, yes. I'll speak a bit slower. So there's only put a point in the chat. Sorry about that. Taking breaks, always helpful. Getting to know your colleagues, checking with them, encouraging self-care. That's definitely a really good point to what we do in terms of managing our colleagues as well. So that's a really good point for later. Feeling drained, depressed, tired. Yeah, feeling like emotions a bit more on the surface. So wanting to cry, everything or nothing. Yeah, so feeling a bit more emotional, or everything's a bit more heightened. So absolutely. Getting irritable, shaky. Irritable is one that seems to be quite consistent. That fatigue, anxiety, yeah, tired, can't think straight, finding it difficult to speak, or non-verbal, kind of going in on ourselves. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Feeling overwhelmed. So I think it's really important to do this exercise, really, to start noticing that in yourselves. The more you notice that, the more you're able to stop yourself. So for anyone else, people were sharing in the chat earlier how they weren't sure for some of their own characteristics, what are the signs for them. So think about yourself. If you haven't done it today, have a think after today, after this session. Think about what do I actually do when I'm starting to feel a bit more drained? So what we're trying to do is avoid that getting to empty. We want to put good things in place before we get to that stage. So if you haven't shared in the chat, if you're not sure, have a think after today. What are the signs that I'm starting to get a bit more stressed? Think about a moment you've been stressed recently and what you did differently. So really, a few people have started mentioning in the chat kind of what they do for their own self-care. It's so important to prioritize that and setting those boundaries for making time for that. I know that can always depend on the environment you're in the workplace and whether that's possible. So something we'll talk about right at the end in terms of as an employer, what we can do differently, because it's not the responsibility only of the individual to put these things in place. Also having the space within the organization to do that. But please do share in the chat anything you find helpful. How do you engage in self-care? I think the first thing definitely is about prioritizing yourself, making that time for yourself, and putting these things in place. So the value of sleep, making sure we're getting enough sleep, that can make a massive difference to our mental health, our mental clarity. Diet, something that can easily slip off when we're feeling a bit a bit stressed or low. Some people might comfort eat or eat less. That can again impact our mental health a bit more. So making sure we have time to eat a healthy meal, drinking enough water is so important. Exercise. And when we're busy, if we're overworking, if we find ourselves staying longer at work, we're not making time for that run we're going to go on or go into the gym. So making sure we make time for that. Doesn't have to be anything too big. Even something as small as a 20-minute walk can make a big difference to our mood. Making time for our hobbies outside of work. So I think really trying to make time and creating those boundaries to prioritize these is really important. So yeah, as I mentioned here, so creating a routine, swimming. Yeah, so I've mentioned it can be hard in certain workplaces. Don't always respect it. Absolutely. So there is always that challenge. So definitely the last thing we'll talk about today is as employees, what we should be doing differently. Running, saying no to things, it's okay to say no is a really important point. It really comes on to our boundaries chat here. So thinking about having those strong boundaries to say no and thinking about it in terms of managing your mental health enables you to be more productive in work. As a few of you have mentioned in the chat, it really depends on the workplace you're in, how they respect that. So I think that's what we talk about in the next section. But really kind of discussing that, saying no if you need to have a break, is something that's really important. Yeah, exactly. Someone's put a comment at the bottom here, which is the mantra I always try and live by, is putting yourself first. Not in a selfish way, but more in, if I put myself first, I'm more able to support others if I'm at my best. So even for anyone here who works in a role that's very much client facing or caregiving or anything like that, as this individual was mentioning in their comment, burning ourselves out isn't going to help anyone. We're more productive and helpful in the long term if we look after ourselves. So that's a really important way of looking at it. Yeah, so someone's mentioned in the chat here, pressure at work and workloads can really burn someone out. Put all your energy into your work, neglect looking after yourself. Exactly. So really making sure you have time for those, prioritizing yourself, setting those boundaries. And I think from a neurodiversity standpoint, where this is important, is thinking about those boundaries, discussing your needs with managers, and then starting to have those conversations. Either you can broach that conversation, start that conversation with them if you feel like it's a safe space to do so, but also as managers and colleagues, how are we starting those conversations with people about what they need? Something we'll talk about in this last section now. So thinking about not just ourselves, but thinking about your neurodivergent colleagues. If you're a manager, if you're just a colleague, you might not have anyone in your team who has, as someone mentioned in the chat, kind of come out as neurodivergent. Not everyone may have disclosed or discussed that they are neurodivergent or they have a diagnosis. People can be masking their differences. So I think, what can we do to encourage people to support their well-being? Yeah, and support the well-being of those who are neurodivergent. What can we do differently? First point here, don't be afraid to ask. Absolutely. So I always encourage kind of not really necessarily going out and asking everyone, do you have a diagnosis? But even just encouraging kind of, what do you need? What do you find helpful? What's your way of working? It's much more inclusive. Don't need a diagnosis to do that. As an employee or a manager, don't feel like you need to have a diagnosis in order to act. Those supportive conversations can take place regardless. So definitely a good way of doing that. Finding out what support they want. They might have found something really helpful in the past, previous managers. Yeah, thinking about the strengths of each person as well. Thinking about the workload you have, where could they be best utilized? Creating a supportive, inclusive, educated, educated workforce that allows for neurodivergent colleagues to be open and honest. Absolutely. So how do we create that psychological safety? So raising that awareness in the workforce, maybe talking about the value of neurodiversity, I think that's really good. Helping people feel like, oh, it's okay for me to share this here. Yeah, open up about your difficulties. I always like this way of kind of helping people see it's a safe space to chat. If you're sharing, oh, I found this difficult, I did this differently, kind of normalizing it, making people feel it's okay to share their thoughts as well on what they're going through. Yeah, I think what someone's mentioned here, kind of even just role modeling, taking more frequent, shorter breaks, to regaining that focus. So if you're doing that, people can see it, and they might ask why you're doing that. You can say, oh, I find this helpful for me for this reason. They might think, oh, it is okay for me to do things differently. I can ask for different things. So again, that role modeling is helpful. If someone comes to work already stressed, you notice that as well, because you'll know your colleagues better than someone else outside your team might do. So can you notice those differences? Can you offer that opportunity to talk? That's really helpful. We need to understand more about well-being at work and prioritising this for individuals. Absolutely, it's a lot more work that can be done about understanding why it's important, not just from a well-being standpoint, but how everyone benefits in terms of performance as well. It gets the best out of everyone. Everyone feels happier. Confidence is higher. Definitely more to be done. Focus on seeing all people as people, regardless of illness and neurodiversity. Absolutely. So don't feel like you need to even really kind of label people neurodivergent. You're just talking about them as individuals and what they need. Having a manager guide, yeah, something I've definitely worked on with organizations before, giving them the confidence. Often hear managers not having the confidence in even broaching these conversations, starting these conversations. So what can you do to give them those tools to start that? Listening to what you need. Don't need to be an expert in neurodiversity to have these conversations. Just listening is a really important part of that. Something I spoke about in our workplace preferences webinar last time. So if anyone missed that, we'll be having that later in the year as well. So you can see that again. Someone's put a comment here. So just to play devil's advocate for a moment, sometimes it seems better to tell only a select few people and then to maintain the masks for the majority of people who rely on you, own resources and routines to carry you. Given that most people don't understand or will bring their own interpretations of what you are trying to explain, or perhaps worse, or try to help but make things worse, making it even more difficult to extricate for certain situations or to have good relationships. Yeah, really, it's absolutely, it's really up to you who you're disclosing that to. A lot of people just want to disclose it to their manager. Some people might disclose it to their team. Some people might share it with the organization, which is also nice if it empowers others. But really, it's up to you. It's your energy as well. You've got to decide what's best for you and how you want to share that. If it allows you to do your job in a productive way for you, it really does make a difference how you want to share that. So it's what's best for you is really important. I'll share a few thoughts that I've got. So how do you build that neuro inclusivity? I'll put this here while I kind of talked about a few of these when we were doing the stress slide, but I'll just talk through the last comment here. So we have reasonable adjustment passports that an individual can continue to use throughout career. Yeah, so a lot of organizations starting to use this now, the adjustment passport, the idea of having that written down, kind of what they find helpful. It's really helpful as well for when if you change roles or if you change role or your manager changes. You don't feel like you're having to keep repeating yourself, which I know I've heard some people say they find quite annoying, having to start from scratch and have that conversation again with someone who doesn't understand. So having that written down, when someone starts in a role, they can share that. They can look through how that individual works. It's definitely helpful. So psychological safety, sort of spoken about indirectly throughout. So I think the idea of role modeling, sharing the value of neurodiversity, sharing what's available, encouraging conversations, making people feel safe to talk about this in different ways. Like I said earlier, there might be people in your team who who are neurodivergent, who are masking. So you don't know they are neurodivergent. So how do you approach them? How do you encourage them to start talking with you? So all those things you spoke about in terms of encouraging conversations, talking to people about their needs, role modeling, that flexibility and autonomy. So I think giving people flexibility to work in a way that suits them. I know since COVID, there's been a lot more flexibility in hybrid working. People be able to work in environments that suit them better. So that's definitely helpful. Someone mentioned the chat here about network groups and peer support. I've always find that really helpful in terms of encouraging conversations. People can see other people openly talking about it and get advice from others as well. I think it's always helpful. Encouraging adjustment conversations, making that normalized amongst your team, not just people with neurodiversity or with a diagnosis. Thinking about it, we all might have subtle things we find helpful. Just starting those conversations. You might be surprised who comes to you and says, actually, I've got this diagnosis. So it might be the person you least suspect because they might have been masking. So always worth starting those conversations. Communication, so how you communicate with individuals. Some people might find they don't process everything that's been said in the meeting. They might prefer things written down. Always checking in with them. And lastly, the built environment. This is an exhaustive list, something we've got a webinar later in the year talking about building that neuro-inclusive culture, just a few ideas here. Thinking about the built environment. So thinking about those sensory sensitivities. Are we making people come into an environment which they find really stressful? Is there anything we can do to give them those quiet spaces in the office? Can they work from home at certain points to help get some energy back from those days? I think from those sensory sensitivity standpoint, it can be quite hard to know if you don't experience the challenges yourself. So always worth asking people, is there anything here that you find really overwhelming? If you are in the office, is there anything we can change? Yeah, just a few ideas here. I'll leave this up I'll open up to questions now, but I'll leave this personal action plan up as I always do. I think it's a nice way of just for you all to reflect on what actually am I going to do differently this week or the next month. So what is one thing you might do differently? You might start doing? What is one thing you thought, actually, no, this is quite good. I might continue doing this. And is there anything you're thinking, oh, I need to stop doing this? So if you're willing to share, please do in the chat. If you want to have a quiet reflection, please do that as well. If not, I'm happy to open up to any questions if anyone has any. Someone's mentioned, so what I struggle to understand is how scary it can be to apply for jobs. So many job descriptions state you need to work in a busy environment or you're required to multitask. Yeah, that kind of need to love working in a fast-paced environment, kind of cliche bit in the job description. Absolutely, something I've worked on a lot in previous work, looking at making job descriptions more neuro-inclusive. What are we actually asking people to do? I think there's a lot of jargon that can be in job descriptions that can throw people off. And if people don't feel like they're kind of that great communicator or team player, some of those things we often hear, can put them off applying in the first place. And there might be a lot of neurodivergent people that don't even apply for the role, even if they're perfect for it, because they're thrown off by some of those things in job descriptions. Maybe that's something for the future for us to discuss in one of these sessions, that kind of neuro-inclusive recruitment. But yeah, it's so challenging. So how do we create that kind of hiring process that encourages people to apply? There's so many people who know we've spoken to who say, I know I can do this job, but I always struggle with interviews, being put on the spot, psychometrics or tests under time pressure during the recruitment. And some people will say, oh, as some organizations now, we spoke about in our webinar in December, talking about different hiring initiatives now being opened up to encourage neurodivergent employees to apply. Having those maybe internships can be quite helpful. So yeah, I think there's things there that organisations are starting to think about a lot more. Someone's mentioned here, this training has to be separately given for managerial level work managers, directors. Yeah, I would personally really enjoy those sessions as well. I think talking to managers, I think they're really good to they can be the gateway to really support a lot of people. So if you can really speak to them, help them to encourage doing a lot of those things we spoke about on the previous slide, that'll make a big difference to a lot of people's perception of work. So I think absolutely. Is speech impediment such as stammering a type of neurodivergent? It's a good question. You can sometimes see that. I think it's separate, but you can sometimes see it with dyspraxia, I guess because it's linked with motor coordination, something called verbal dyspraxia, where they might find it hard to articulate themselves clearly on the spot. They might need to rehearse what they want to say a bit more. So yeah, you see it, some similarities and characteristics, but I think it might be separate, worth researching. I'll have a look into that. If anyone needs to drop off, absolutely no problem. You're welcome. So I'll put a question here. I have neurodivergent children who will be going to school, job interviews soon. Should they disclose that they're neurodivergent? Why are they being considered weird? This is a really good question because, so we mentioned earlier, recruitment practices can be quite old-fashioned and rigid. I think there's a lot of power in disclosing it, asking for adjustments. I think it's also a good way for me if I was in that situation where it's a good way of kind of vetting what the organization's like, because how they react to that question or what you propose to them, it's going to be a indication of what they're going to be like when you get into the organization. A lot of people, statistically, I think nearly half of individuals don't disclose their neurodivergent until they're 6 months into a role because they're worried about how they're going to be perceived. I think there's benefits of doing so because you can see how they act. It might make you think, actually, I don't want to work there. I'd rather work somewhere else. Because there are a lot of organisations that are a lot more inclusive. Alternatively, they might think, well, actually, I don't need to disclose. There's no requirement for them to disclose. They might decide not to and just ask for certain adjustments. And that's also completely fine. So definitely a personal choice. There's benefits of both. Someone's put in the comments there, they're entitled to reasonable adjustments. Absolutely. So there is that entitlement there. So legally, there's a lot more cases of tribunals or cases going to tribunal because of people not getting adjustments to the workplace. There is that entitlement there. I mentioned earlier the story of younger generations kind of being more aware of what they're entitled to in terms of a neurodivergent point, what adjustments are available. They've had them in education where maybe other people haven't in the past. So there's growing awareness, which really helps. So I would say it's definitely beneficial to ask for adjustments if you are neurodivergent, and just it's a good way of seeing what the organisation works, how they work. Yeah, and people have been great in sharing a few ideas of adjustments there, like getting interview questions beforehand, which I always think is really helpful for just helping from an organisation point of view, understand who's the best person for the role, not just the best person at responding on the spot. So you understand people's experience and what they can bring to the role a lot better. So it definitely helps the employer as well. We're out of time, unfortunately. So sorry if I didn't get to some of your questions. So feel free to send us an email if anyone has any additional questions they'd rather ask privately. But no, thank you everyone for joining today. I hope it's been helpful. And thank you for all your contributions. It always helps bring the session to life a lot more. So thank you everyone for sharing your experiences. Yeah, as I mentioned, the group chat's been amazing. Yeah, it's always much better. There's a lot more people sharing their thoughts and what they've found helpful. So yeah, have a lovely afternoon or rest of the morning, depending on where you are. I'm sure we'll see you next month.